welcome. Hare Krishna, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Appreciate you joining us for this session. This session is hosted by the Vaishnavi ministry. It's part of the 16 days of activism against gender violence. It's a continuation of a conversation around trying to involve more men in this kind of conversation, supporting the women and their families and their communities, and encouraging other men as well to look at these issues. And this session is called Advice I Would Give My Son. And I'm joined today by Uttama Devi Dasi and Partha Das. So thank you so much for joining me. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, it's good. So let's dive right in. What are your thoughts, I suppose, just to set the scene, where maybe contextually where you are and your long experience in the movement around why it is important to involve men in this conversation, and also why it's important the way that we bring up our sons and daughters, but today we're talking about sons.
It's important. There's one initiative, I think in North America at least, where posters are put up in public restrooms with information for anyone who's a victim of domestic abuse, which is generally women. And someone visited our temple recently in Sarnagati, and they said, "You have those kind of problems here too?" And unfortunately, yes, that's domestic violence, domestic verbal abuse, mistreatment of women. Unfortunately, it's present in all countries, all economic brackets, all kinds of different religions. It's something that's prevalent everywhere, and it's something that we all have to do, is try to understand how to address that problem and create a culture where we recognize it is a problem and create especially education that can help individuals realize how to rectify the situation.
So my husband and I, we started forming with some other devotees a group of interested people for helping devotees with their marriages. So for 20 years, my husband and I have worked with the Grihastha Vision Team. And one of the reasons that we were inspired to work with the Grihastha Vision Team is we live in a rural community. And we see that family is really the basis of community. When one family has a problem, we all have a problem. And we also see that when couples get along well, usually their children can grow up in a very nice environment. And then when the children feel supported and protected, they go on to have healthy families in continuation. And so we're very motivated to see that support's there for families, because it's so essential.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like you say, it can sometimes seem like it's a particular family's issue, or sometimes it can be seen like it's a women's issue. But actually, when you think of families and communities and how interconnected really we are, like it's really everyone's issue, isn't it? Including, in this case, we're talking about men, because sometimes some people would even. I've been in environments where people would say this is not a place for men. It's almost like this is a women's issue, but I think that only makes it harder to solve the issue, right? If we're not all working towards the same aim, if you like.
And we can see that when fathers and other men, they instill good values in the young boys and the young girls. They grow up emulating that, and it gets reinforced. So it's very essential.
One thing I'd love to ask, and not to dwell on it, but we'll move past it, but what do you think, because like you said, somebody might come from the outside and presume that because we're trying to follow a spiritual path, that, we wouldn't have these issues, maybe they might think. And of course, because we're just people, like we're a selection of people following this path, but we're not that different from anybody else to start with. So we're going to have different issues, like you say, that we bring from our own experiences, and so on growing up. But I'd like to, so that sort of puts us on an equal footing. But like, from your experience, what things have you come across, whether they're in the philosophy or they're being interpreted from the philosophy, that have almost, for a certain period of time, almost appeared to justify certain behaviors that haven't been so healthy?
That's unfortunate reality that sometimes individuals come from dysfunctional backgrounds where that kind of behavior was, abusive behavior just was like the social norm. And when individuals come from that kind of background and start reading the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, they can view what they hear through that filter of their upbringing and use the philosophy, unfortunately, to justify that kind of behavior. And that's a catastrophic misuse of the philosophy. Just like Srila Prabhupada describes how Varnashram became corrupted, and one section of society was using their position to lord it over all the others in society. And similarly, in Krishna consciousness, we may use our gender or our position based on our warped paradigms that we've developed from our upbringing to misapply the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And to me, I think one of the most important verses in the Bhagavatam is the second verse of the Bhagavatam, which describes how the Bhagavatam, it is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. And that's a kind of a key essential factor in understanding our philosophy, is not how I can use a philosophy to get what I need and what I want and get myself some prestige and distinction. But it's actually meant for us to understand, how can I apply that in my life so I can be a better person, and I can also make the lives of others better. And I think that's a very important point that we miss sometimes in trying to properly understand how to apply the philosophy of Krishna consciousness.
That's a really good point, actually. Do you think, though, because I think that's a very insightful thing I'd not really thought about it specifically. I'm going to give that some good thought. But equally, that would sort of sound like that there's just a couple of individuals who sort of disparately come with and see it in their own way. But I would put forward that actually there's a broader, almost wholesale culture that was developed around that kind of thinking. And I wonder if, what do you think about that?
My take on this is that there's sections of the Vedas which are very hierarchical, and a lot of emphasis placed on the responsibility of men. And it's good if men are responsible.
Yeah.
However, sometimes there are statements that seem a little derogatory towards women. Now, there's all sorts of things in the Vedas. There's demigod worship, there's all sorts of things. We see that Srila Prabhupada, he chose from the vast Vedas those principles and teachings which were Vaishnava and which led us towards pure love of God. And he didn't focus on some of these extra corollary Vedic things. Now, as devotees become more well-read, they read more of the Vedas, and maybe they're not looking at it strictly through the Vaishnava lens. And I see that Prabhupada greatly distinguished. And we have to learn that also. And sometimes you will see Prabhupada's even explaining in his purports the Vedic social setting. His action of application was quite different. It was very Vaishnava. And that's why we have to see how Prabhupada practically applied these things. And we have to apply them through a compassionate Vaishnava lens. Otherwise, we're going to take birth again to lord it over. That's why we're here, isn't it? In the material world, because you want to lord it over. And you pick these positions which funnel you to lord it over again, you're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting point you made about how when he's describing, because this is where, though, people I completely agree with you, but people will often say, well, if it's in the books, then it's sort of like a higher level of, whatever. And so you say he's explaining the Vedic system was like this or like that. You're absolutely right. It would make a lot more sense to look at how he actually applied it in real life.
Yes.
But unfortunately, there's well, if it's in the books or if he said it, that's kind of like more almost like scripture. That's like written. It's in black and white. And I wonder if, like, of course, there's a whole body of work, but unfortunately, and even compared to the whole body of work, they're tiny. But you could probably find 10 or 20 or maybe more statements from Prabhupada himself. Like it's okay to beat a woman, or a woman is, like there's so many that you could find. And so what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to like hone in on them but I'm just trying to say that there's enough of a body of that kind of stuff to fuel these other things.
If you don't read it in context, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what is the context? I mean, of something like that to be said? I don't know. I'm not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's sort of a strange thing to say in any context, I think.
I came across a very interesting question that was asked to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur by one of his disciples. And the question was, why is it in the scriptures and the works of our acharyas, sometimes we'll find these kind of contradictory statements. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta replied that those statements appear contradictory from the material platform. And from the liberated platform, there is no distinction. There is no contradiction on the liberated platform. And then he said something very interesting, which I think is really deep. He said those statements, those contradictions are there to protect the sanctity of the Shastra from the prying eyes of the demons. So what I took from that, if we approach the Shastra with the wrong attitude and mood, we're going to come with some very erroneous conclusions that are going to damage us and could possibly damage others. And that's why, like Uttama was saying, it's very important. We have to understand what is the Vaishnava conclusion of our teachings. There was also a very interesting conversation in Prema Bhavarta. Sri Damodar and Raghunath Das Goswami, I think it was Sri Damodar asked Raghunath Das, what are the duties of a Grihastha in Varnashram? And the reply was, their duty is to accept those Varnashram Vedic principles that are conducive to developing pure bhakti, and to diligently reject those things which don't foster bhakti. And so when I read that, I thought that was Prabhupada, perfect description of Prabhupada. He knew exactly what to apply from the Vedic principles to nurture bhakti in others. And as you were discussing this point, I also remember Yamuna Devi was telling us of one incident. She was with Srila Prabhupada in India, and she's in the back seat of a car with her husband and I think some other sannyasi. Prabhupada's in the front seat. Car's driving, and Yamuna said Prabhupada turned around and said to her, Chanakya Pandit says women are less intelligent. Isn't that true, Yamuna? And Yamuna is such a humble, devoted person. She said to Prabhupada, yes, Prabhupada, whatever the Guru says is absolute. It's true, Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada turned to her again and said, no. He said, you're not a woman, you're a Vaishnavi. You are a Vaishnavi. You are not a woman. So if we put those kind of material designations on, whether it's women or someone has some designation in Varnashram, we think they're a Sudra, we missed the point by a country mile.
Yeah, I understand that one. I've heard that story. It's a lovely story. But if I may, I find it a bit troublesome because, like, sometimes you'll have people. You see, I just feel it's dangerous for us to be in our bubble too much sometimes. Like, so, for example, like we kind of have a little sort of a phrase or a thing to tie up everything into a neat bow because we've got an answer for this and an answer for that. And actually, maybe we're sort of justifying something that is actually not, helpful. So, like, for example, they say, these women are not less intelligent because they're these are Vaishnav women. But
But
I'm
Prabhupada
thinking,
said women and Vaishnavi.
oh, did he?
Yes, you're not a woman. It's like any designation. We're per spirit souls. So I took it that way at first too, and then I realized Prabhupada's actually being quite broad about it.
Yeah, no, well, the one that's often quoted is people say these women are not less intelligent because they're Vaishnavis.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is like, so what are you saying then? You should respect Vaishnavis and you shouldn't respect women, which is ridiculous,
Right.
So I just think that sometimes it's kind of like, yeah, it's still true that like women are, useless, but not if they're Vaishnavis. Do you know what I mean? And I just think it's
We
just
don't want to fall into that trap either because it's bodily designation.
Yeah, but a lot of people, a lot of devotees, when they discuss this, that's the way they quote it, and they,
But then
And I
I'm
think-
better all of a sudden because I'm a Vaishnava and I can lord it over someone else, and you're back to square one.
yeah, exactly. There's
And
no,
we can understand on the highest platform of Vaishnavism, one would think everyone is actually a Vaishnava. Everyone is engaged in Krishna service except for me.
yeah, for sure, that's the way. But I mean, like, what's interesting is that people who are not aware or acting as Vaishnavas, they can have this level of respect. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's almost like we're kind of we're fortunate in that we feel like we've been gifted with something that is very amazing, and it is. But I think by association, therefore, we sort of suddenly feel like we're upgraded now and we're better than other people, or that we don't have to cultivate actual good qualities in practice. We just can sort of have things to say and stuff, whereas someone who's just in the world trying to do their best is kind of understanding, yeah, of course I should respect people, whoever they are, Well, let's bring it back. It's something that you mentioned, Partha Prabhu, about like it's important, just before we started, that it's important to not just have the words and everything, but to set the example.
Yes.
So tell me, maybe in your own life or in the experience of people that have you seen it both ways, where people talk and don't live it out, and then where people do?
I feel myself very fortunate because I grew up in a very large extended family, lots of aunts and uncles and cousins. And my experience growing up was that all the men treated the women very respectfully. And it was a very nice atmosphere. So I kind of grew up in that atmosphere. And as Uttama was saying, that we never and she had a similar experience. And so we never experienced the other reality until we joined ISKCON. And also from my experience, and our experience working with a lot of couples in marital education, we find there's a lot of individuals who have had some kind of abusive or traumatic experiences growing up. And especially the experience of growing up in a overly patriarchal atmosphere where you might be put down for who you are and always criticized and judged and shamed. It tends to wear away your sense of your self-esteem. And especially when we hear those kind of things from someone who's very important to us in our life, a caregiver or our parents, that hurts a lot more than if someone on the street, says, "Oh, you're just a fool." That's just like water off a duck's back or something. But if someone you're very close to, a parent, a caregiver, says those kind of things, it kind of creates an emotional scar. And depending on the severity and frequency of those kind of things, it can leave at different degrees of emotional scars. And especially for men, one of the biggest fears of men is the fear of being inadequate. And what happens, like one of our subject is, this is an initiative to kind of address domestic abuse. And what happens with men who have those kind of emotional scars, they weren't able to process them, they're kind of hidden within. And then later on in their adult life, they become married, and then their significant other may say some small thing in any other context wouldn't really trigger anyone. However, because they've had those kind of negative experiences, being criticized and ridiculed, there's like a scar tissue there, And it just, let's say like you had a broken rib or a dislocated shoulder, and if I just came up and said, "Oh, hi, Bull," and just tried to give you this big hug, you're probably going to push me away because that's going to hurt like hell. So for individuals who have those kind of emotional scars, they can get triggered very, very easily by that pain in the past, and that pain in the past will manifest in the present, and they'll tend to become very angry because that's what they saw as a child, that their caregiver, their principal caregiver, would tend to react with anger and or violence, and that would give them this sense of control. So the same thing happens when they grow up. That pattern becomes self-perpetuating. They become angry, and the problem with anger and why these people tend to become angry repeatedly is that anger produces adrenaline, and adrenaline actually numbs pain. So as a man, I might have that emotional injury, my spouse says something that triggers that pain, I become angry, and that anger numbs that sense of inadequacy that I felt as a child. It numbs my pain. And unfortunately, if that isn't addressed and corrected, those patterns tend to repeat themselves again and again in relationships, and therefore we have so much violence. So sometimes it may manifest as, domestic violence. Sometimes it may manifest as verbal abuse, which can be as damaging as physical abuse. And it can also manifest as extreme patriarchal attitudes, in which I was always dominated and controlled when I was a child, so therefore now
I get to dominate.
Yeah, now I can dominate and control my wife or my friends or whatever. And I think the root of a lot of these problems comes from our upbringing, and that's why it's so important we have to work within our society to create healthy families and be able to identify those kind of problems in individuals and get them help so they can process those pains in the past and not be triggered by them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's interesting there is that I think a man, when he's in that moment, he sees the person, whoever it is, it could be a child, it could be another man, or it could be a woman, as an external sort of manifestation, or almost he believes that the pain that he's feeling is coming from that person because of what they said.
Yes.
So, but actually it's how he feels about himself.
Yeah.
And that's why
and
you
he's
hear
lumping in the remembrance of all the past pains to the same interaction. So it's a conglomeration.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it could have been his mother. It could have also been a woman.
Yeah.
Always knocking him down or whatever, and also kind of feeling that that you hear these phrases are like she made me do it, or and unfortunately, and it's actually predominant not just in we have some not philosophical but phrases that people might lean to. But it's there, you see it in a lot of patriarchal societies. It's a common thing, where it's kind of like the woman is seen as the temptation and also the bondage and the kind of the one who lures you and traps you and all this kind of thinking around all that stuff. That kind of therefore, and it's almost like the opposite side of attraction and repulsion. Like I'm so drawn to women. Then if they hurt me, then they'll have my full wrath, to the degree that I'm attracted, So it's a very powerful dynamic and a complicated one. But I agree with you. And what have you tried, or what kind of ways have you helped people? Because obviously some people, especially in old days, would have said, just have to chant Hare Krishna and there's nothing else. And obviously we that's an experiment that's been done already. So how else, what other ways do you think people need to get support and help in these things?
I would say the answer is yes, the holy name. 100% the answer is the holy name. And especially based on a statement that Prabhupada made, I think it's in the 5th canto, where Prabhupada describes when sciences like chemistry and psychology, 2nd canto, and psychology, when they're used solely and wholly in the service of the Lord, Prabhupada's exact words are, they factually become Hari Kirtan. When we utilize these kind of skills from like psychology to help us pull out those kind of anartas, that's non-different than kirtan. That's a form of divine anarta nivriti. So one thing we developed within our group is a whole network of devotee counselors. So if we encounter individuals who have some kind of traumatic experience from the past, we can get some resources to help them process it and be able to live their life not triggered by the past, but be able to be proactive and realize there's some pain in the past, and they can manage that and can move on and live a healthy future.
So basically, a person has to feel the pain, acknowledge it. That hurts. What can I do to make it better? Because the other person must be hurting also. So how can I understand that I'm in pain, they're in pain, and how can I reach out and help and be compassionate? So it's that lack of compassion that makes us self-centered and not focused on the other person. So whether you're whether children are brought up even in reasonably healthy households, they still need to learn that process. That when something's bothering them, somebody said something to them, they've lost something that was important to them, they're upset in some way. That as parents, we need to just hear it. Okay, I'm upset and that doesn't feel good. And then, depending on their age, so what do you think we could do to rectify the situation? I can give you some suggestions and you have some too, and let's see if you can figure out how you can get yourself to a better position and something that you can do. And so that's what's basically called emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
You have to actually look at it, practice it. And emotional intelligence comes through your parenting, in that you learn emotional regulation from your parents. If your parents couldn't emotionally regulate, you're probably not going to be able to. So one of the most important things we can teach our sons, daughters, is to be able to understand that process of emotional regulation. And it's, for number one, you just can't function in this world without it. And also nowadays...
You can function, but you do a lot of damage.
Nowadays, marriages are very different than they were in traditional things where you had your role, you knew what your job was, you knew, your position. Everyone had their roles. And you had great extended family. You got your, emotional needs met by many people. Now we're in nuclear families. Women don't survive without emotional care. And so men have to learn how to be emotionally intelligent if they want to get their needs met, because that's how we work together. And so there's no getting around it. It's an extra tool that you have to learn nowadays in Kali Yuga, because that is the societal scenarios. In Vedic times, the examples of Shastra were given in different social scenarios. But it's just the social application to illustrate it. The principles are still the same, that we have to have compassion.
Isn't it interesting, though? Would you not? I agree with you entirely. I think it's learning how to deal with uncomfortable feelings, in a healthy way. But if I just may, so the way that we could sort of frame it there is that because it's Kali Yuga and everything is so terrible, we have to cultivate these things. I would argue that these things are actually better. Like everyone, this is actually an upgrade rather than a problem to have to cultivate these things. I think in a way, isn't it actually a superior person who can actually cultivate these things than someone who had a different cultural thing that didn't have to?
I guess I should reframe that. Maybe women didn't have to look for men for all their emotional support. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
however,
men,
I do think that men learned it in other ways. And I think it was just more inherent in the culture, so it's not explicit when we read Shastra, because it was understood. We don't have that, so we don't see it.
Yes.
And
There's
we
a lot of
read in the
invisible
Bhagavatam,
things in culture.
Yeah.
and we read in the Bhagavatam how in the age of Kali Yuga, men's finer sentiments become lost, and also women's. And I read a study about the usage of emotions over a long period of time, and there was a graph which was illustrating how, as time has progressed, our vocabulary for emotions is gradually decreasing and decreasing, and to the point where in today's world, especially young people, if something's really cool, they'll say, well, that's really wicked, or that's
Well, that's
dope.
fire.
Yeah, so we don't really have that broad spectrum of emotions, and we don't know how to deal with emotions. I mean, before COVID, there was a study that came out. There was some concern that in Canada, the male suicide rate had gone up 4 times higher than the women's suicide rate, and they were trying to understand what's happening with the male population. And they attributed it to the fact of men just don't have that emotional vocabulary. They don't know how to deal with emotions. They don't know how to understand what they're feeling. And when you can't, if you name emotion, you can tame it. You can process it. When you can't name it, it just kind of builds up inside of you. And they came to understand that why men were committing suicide more was because they just didn't have that emotional ability to process what was going on in their lives. It would just build up inside of them to the point that they couldn't tolerate it anymore. And that's such a great tragedy. And just to bring that back to the reality of Vaishnavas, it's actually essential for us all, whether we're men or women, children, to develop that kind of emotional world within us, because ultimately we want to develop love of Krishna. And we study the nectar devotion, Srimad Bhagavatam. You see these amazing emotional exchanges between Krishna and his devotees. And so my question is, how will we even begin to be able to comprehend that emotional realm in the spiritual world if we can't even access our own emotions? So it's a very important part of our spiritual life to understand what's going on within ourselves and how to manage and deal with those kind of emotions, and to teach especially our sons and daughters how to do that also.
It's a great point. I think sometimes people say, the patriarchal system, often people focus on how it's difficult for women, but it's also difficult for men, especially in, maybe when there was a time when men were, if there was a time when men were like so powerful and strong and all of that, then perhaps they, didn't maybe need to kind of, I don't know, maybe they were able to find that source from within themselves or whatever it was, to be strong. But I think that a lot of people talk also about how patriarchy, because it puts that huge pressure on men, and maybe they aren't all that. Maybe they are more vulnerable or more sensitive or more whatever, and they feel that burden that they think they're supposed to carry, like with just strong shoulders, and not, ever kind of consider their emotions or whatever. That's also a huge burden to carry. And I think that like you say, there, all across, interesting to hear about it in Canada, but it's the world over. It seems that a lot of men don't feel that they have anyone, they don't have close friends that they can, male friends that they can talk to about this kind of stuff. And they may not be, it's funny, even as I'm about to say it, it's sort of very unpopular thing to say, but they may not be feeling appreciated in their life. We tend to think, rightly, that, often women are not appreciated. But equally, like, whoever we are, men or women, we all need to feel some appreciation from the people we're with. But it should go both ways. So it's interesting, isn't it, that like everyone is feeling unappreciated, and it hurts men just as much as it would a woman, even though we like to think that they're supposed to be tough and strong and not get affected by it. So one of the things that we had written down was, how do we raise our sons with a healthy understanding of masculinity? So masculinity, obviously, big word, could be seen from many perspectives. What are your thoughts on a healthy sense of masculinity?
I see that a healthy sense of masculinity is something very broad. And nowadays, materialistic society, it praises two qualities in men, lust and anger. And so it funnels people towards that. And very often, boys go from high school to college. And when they try to be sensitive towards others, they're called a sissy and this and that. They're feminized as, as demoniac qualities.
Much worse things they're called as well.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I know, of course.
We have a public broadcast here. So we need to debunk a lot of that, because in some ways it's materialism that wants to program men to function in certain ways so that when they produce, they are good. And we can never produce perfectly, wonderfully all the time. We need to understand that we're all part and parcel of God, and we're valuable. Even if, we didn't get the contract in on time or whatever, Yeah. And so we need to actually understand what true self-esteem is to understand that we are part and parcel of Krishna, and we're worthy of love. And women, we get our sense of false self-esteem, how others view us. Oh, you're pretty. Oh, you're beautiful. Oh, you said that nice. And so we become people pleasers. But that doesn't make us, anything great. We're great because we're part and parcel of Krishna. And so we need that appreciation of who we are, and even the things that we are doing right. When someone says, oh, that was really helpful. Thank you so much for, coming out and carrying all the groceries in for me. That was, really, made me feel loved and protected and cared for. When my husband hears that from me, he's going to get reinforced. Oh, she likes that, because some women, why are you helping me? I can do this myself. But I'm showing that behavior in him, I appreciate that he wants to help me and thinks I'm valuable. And so when I share that appreciation, he can know what he's doing right. And he can, feel good about himself and do more of it. Not that, oh, I'm great, I did it, but you know how to choose your actions according to what's beneficial.
And those kind of exchanges are what your children, especially the boys, need to see when they're growing up. That they grow up in that kind of culture where they see the kind of appreciation and respect and care for each other. We've met couples and individuals who, we asked them to talk about their role models in marriage, what kind of positive role models. And there's some individuals that they say they draw a complete blank. That's so tragic, because then they're going to enter into married life with not even a reference point for what a healthy relationship and a healthy life looks like. It makes it very, very hard for them.
Definitely. A few things came to mind. That we often want formulas,
Formulas?
Sorry, formulas, or stereotypes, I suppose, and I don't know, I guess Prabhupada certainly talks about Vedic this and Vedic that a bit, but I think nowadays people talk about it a lot. They have this idea of Vedic. I mean, I'm really not sure exactly what that is, but it's kind of like whatever it is, it feels very prescriptive. It's a divine way, and this is how it is, and that's it. And I think that, and you just follow the formula, and then, you don't really have to think. You just follow the prescription. And I think what's interesting about that is that there are clues. Male and female natures are different. And, of course, we're both all spirit souls and all of that, but there's still male and there's still female. So I think there's something to examine around it. But at the same time, I think what you said there was very good, is that it's actually the main ingredient is the respect and the communication and the working it out. And it will be different for different couples.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So it's not the one size fits all and just,
No.
But I think a lot of people kind of are looking for that.
Sure,
because
it's easy.
It seems easy to just take some stereotype and just rubber stamp, I'm advanced,
Yeah.
Surrender to me, like stamp on my forehead.
Yeah. So that was interesting because, like you said, and I think that's something for each couple. You know, it takes time also to figure that out. Like
Oh, for
as you,
sure.
Yeah.
you know,
For sure. A good year, if not two, if not 20. I'm still figuring out things about him. We've been married more than 50 years.
yeah.
And
And that's actually a great example, isn't it? Where it's actually about being willing and committed and respectful and communicative enough to continue to work it out. You know, um, and I suppose that means flexibility too, right?
yeah, it's
Because
like,
otherwise, if you're rigid, it's
yeah,
like, well, now we have to separate because it's not the
yeah.
way it should be or whatever, you know.
And in the context of Krishna consciousness, that means we have our individual natures. We're all unique spirit souls. We all have our unique weirdness. That's kind of who we are as spirit souls. And how are we going to integrate that into relationship and into Krishna consciousness? And that's going to take a lot of dialogue, a lot of understanding and respect and collaboration and maybe some accommodations. But again, that's an important part of having a healthy relationship, and also again setting that example that kids grow up in an atmosphere where they see their parents are working things out, and especially in the context of Krishna consciousness, that they're seeing their parents are becoming happy because they're Krishna conscious and trying to apply the philosophy in the right way. And we see some kids, they saw their parents divorce and so many difficulties and so much strain in the families, and they become a little reluctant to embrace Krishna consciousness because they think, well, did that really work for my parents?
Yeah.
Do I want to be like that? So it's, again, it's actually a lot of the onus of responsibility for, in the context of today's conversation, is to teach young boys how to become proper, balanced, masculine men. The onus is on us to really try to become the best we can, and also admit the mistakes we're making. And even with our kids, we can,
Yeah.
maybe one day we flip out our kid, but we can say, well, I'm really sorry, I flipped out yesterday. I was having a bad day. I was really stressed. I didn't, there's probably a better way I can do that. Maybe we can talk about that or something.
Yeah. That's a really good point, isn't it? You're modeling also
Yeah.
that it's okay to make mistakes. It's
Yeah.
okay to admit it. It's okay to want to do better. And
Yeah.
also, like you said there, I thought it was a great one. I've heard that, and it's actually good. Well, not that you would, arguments will happen anyway, but
Yeah.
to see that people argue and they can
Yes.
resolve it and make up.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a good thing.
So I think that that's one of the most important things we can teach our kids is how to figure things out for themselves. Because sometimes we say, you just do it because I said. But what do they do when you're not there to say it? How are they going to figure it out? And, to teach your kids that they don't have to lie. It's okay if you did something wrong. We can figure it out, and we can, we all make mistakes. And let's sit down together and figure out a way we could do it better in another situation. And I was just thinking that that's actually our whole essence of Krishna consciousness. That verse, Tattenu Kampam Shukshamikshmano, that anything that good happens, we see Krishna gave us the ability. And anything that negative happens, Krishna has some lesson for us to learn. And so it doesn't matter if we did it right or we did it wrong. What's the lesson that I need to learn and grow from here? And that's what we have to help our kids to honestly be able to do and to see. And so emotions actually show you, they pinpoint something, just like on the dash of your car, the red light beeps. It doesn't mean we have to beep and scream like a red light. Emotions don't mean you act emotional. They're just a guidepost to see what action and what decision do I have to make and what lesson do I need to learn from this. And that's the whole purpose of human life, is to learn our lessons so that we can go back home, back to Godhead. So the most important thing that we can teach our sons or our daughters is how to honestly see what it is we need to learn, and to help people to learn and think for themselves and make good choices.
And we do that within ourselves. That's self-compassion. To see, okay, I screwed up, made a mistake here. What can I learn from this? How can I do it better? It's a compassionate way of approaching it. And similarly, like domestic abuse, domestic violence, it's actually failure of compassion. That we
To yourself as well
yes,
as the other
yes,
person.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting when you said, I agree very much on those points. I think two things I wanted to pick up on. One is the, think to help our children and ourselves to think for ourselves. And which I agree with entirely. There's a sort of, there's an apparent, tension that I think some people might find within Krishna consciousness, because I think a lot of devotees, to a certain level or to a certain extent, feel like it's a prescription, and it's sort of to be followed in a certain way. And so even just saying think for yourself, I mean it's so obvious, but like there was a long time where that would have seen, and you might have even been preached to that is like ridiculous, like it's just totally like wrong to think for yourself. So I know that,
but we use our knowledge of the scriptures to influence the way in which we make decisions and choose for ourselves.
yeah.
But ultimately, we have to choose how to apply the scripture, because we're the ones applying it. Right. It's not that scripture has no play in it, and we utilize it a lot. It's not, like if you're, what did somebody quote earlier? If you're Kanishta, you view the scriptures through your emotions, but when you hit Majjhima, you view your emotions through the scriptures. And I was thinking, they didn't say the third part, and I thought of a line for when you're Uttama card, but I forgot it right now. It's just this like, the scriptures you're emotionally involved,
And
But that's an advanced level, isn't it? Where you understand that, because in a way, in theory, that you're talking about interpretation in a good way, which
it's called application. I call it application.
Yeah, exactly. But it requires
maturity,
discretion, and maturity.
Yes. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, he explains the whole Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. And he says, just surrender utterly. And then he says, okay, Arjuna, I've explained everything to you. Now do as you wish to do. Mm-hmm. And in that purport to that verse, Srila Prabhupada describes the best way to surrender to Krishna is to think things through as fully as one can with one's intelligence and then decide. So it's not just blind acceptance. It's really, we have to feel it in our heart, our gut, that, this is right. I have to act in this way, with that kind of internal introspection. And that's what Arjuna did.
And that's what love is.
Yeah.
It's not forced.
Yeah.
Yeah. And equally, I suppose, feel it in your gut to do it. And also, if you feel it in your gut, like not to do it, then don't do it.
Yeah.
I was thinking about something the other day, and I don't know if it's a fully formed idea, but it's this idea that you can't actually choose something unless you're also equally willing to not choose it. It's not a choice. It's a kind of a conditioning or some kind of whatever else, So,
Right. So if you don't have the freedom both ways, you haven't really chosen. You just taken the conditioned path. That's what you're saying.
You're going with what your culture or whatever. Some other thing is influencing. Yeah, or peers or whatever. Yeah. So you kind of almost have to be willing, at least in principle, to reject something to fully choose it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. And I think that, maybe I don't know, but, at least in other traditions, you hear people, and it's sort of generally seen as something further along the path, like as almost a, something that maybe more mature practitioners, they come to a point where, they talk about the idea of deconstructing one's faith, not to lose it, but to almost come to it. So it's not just because you're sort of just on the conveyor belt and you're going along with it, but you're really looking at it all over again and actually trying to be willing, some people might say stupid or brave enough to really deeply assess it again, and either you go deeper or maybe you step away. I don't know. But the point is that it's almost going through that.
To see the underlying principle and
Yeah.
reason and benefit underneath it all, so that you
Yeah.
really can embrace it.
So you learn to become proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah. So I heard a great phrase with some from an organization that work a lot with boys, and they talked. Sometimes people will throw out the statement, "Boys will be boys," and there's that somewhat of a kind of a cultural thing that there's boys, and they put this great statement. They said, "Boys won't be boys. Boys will be what we teach them to be." So it's such a powerful statement, and it's something interesting. I remember I was making this documentary about the girls' education in India, and me and my wife were in this cafe, and there was a lady next to us, and we got talking to her, and she said she was doing like a PhD in like gender studies or something like that. And we're going, oh yeah, and I was telling her about the film. And then I was trying to explain to her that actually, I'm really looking at this issue of how we can involve men in the conversation and stuff. She was quite unimpressed, she was sort of like not really, kind of, didn't really buy it. And then a lady at the cafe counter brought out her little baby boy who was like 6 months old or whatever. And everyone started looking at the baby boy, and everyone's kind of going, And then the same lady said, oh, he's going to be a lady killer. And I'm just thinking, it's just implicit. The same thing that you probably stand against in the way that women are treated. You celebrate.
It's like the pendulum swing.
Yeah. So we celebrate men. It doesn't add up. It's like a math sum that does not add up. Mm-hmm. We celebrate, and this is why I suppose it's talking about, the healthy idea of masculinity, that, men are supposed to, and I mean, then it gets complicated because, you hear about the Kshatris. If they're that nature, they should go out and conquer and, plunder and whatever. But women should be this way. And I suppose then we get into this whole idea of men should be, women should be, and we're prescribing again, and it's stereotypes again. And so it's a very complex, it's a very complex thing. So I suppose, and interestingly, my wife and I went on a whole journey as a result of me making the film. I had grown up in a family where, in Ireland, my father was a very successful entrepreneur. My mom, very intelligent in her own capacity, but kind of very much, kind of supported him in all of the things he wanted to do. And interestingly, he became macrobiotic in 1973 in Dublin, which was really weird. So, no dairy, no meat, no sugar, very strict. And my mom kind of had to just kind of go along with it. Everything prepared from scratch, even like, I think she had to grind her own flour. Like it was a whole, thing. And so I think, I saw all of that in our house. There was 3 boys, 1 sister, and it was very male dominated, and everything was kind of, my mom, her role was just there to support, and she did a great job. But like, I think she sacrificed a lot in the process. And I don't know that, and it wasn't on any ill part by my dad, but she wasn't necessarily, it was just expected. She wasn't necessarily really appreciated for doing it. It was just kind of like, well, of course you have to do it, kind of thing. And I think, so I saw that as a template. And then I became into Krishna consciousness, and I accepted all of those phrases, like all the things about women without even really thinking anything of it, because they were, this is from this great source, and I never really thought about that deeply or whatever. And then when I made this film, it was a huge kind of learning curve for me to just think about for a second life and the world from the perspective of a woman. And it was great. I think for me, it was a massive learning thing. And so me and my wife went through this whole kind of thing, exploring it all. And interestingly, we kind of now found ourselves back at a very communicative and collaborative place, but kind of gravitated a bit more towards the traditional roles again. And it was a really interesting journey. And I actually think that's where I suppose it's up to each and every, people to work it out for themselves. But I actually kind of feel like for a bit I was like, thinking and challenging all of that and whatever. And I'm kind of thinking there's a sort of a sense, or at least for us, there's a sort of a feeling of like that certain things just do tend to work better. But I suppose that's something it will be different for each person. And I just wonder, in the context of Krishna consciousness, bringing up boys to have healthy masculinity, should we beware of prescriptive ideas of what women should be like and what men should be like?
I think you have to have both. You have to understand some of the general principles, and then you have to be able to understand all of the nuances and apply it in all the circumstances. And we have to do that all the time in our Krishna consciousness. Like, for example, in the we raised our children in the Vancouver temple, and the men would get the ghee wick and they would pass it around, and then they would pass it over to the ladies' side. Now the teacher asked them, could you put the ghee lamp on the fountain so that I can choose a different girl each time so they could each have a turn?
Yeah.
So it became the ritual. So 20 years later, I'm the only woman over there in Arctique, and the men pass right by me, put the ghee lamp on the fountain, doesn't offer it to me, because that's the way you're supposed to do it.
I've seen that. Yeah.
You know, so it's just, we don't understand the reason behind things. And Prabhupada said we always have to know the reason behind. And he would give it that example of the wedding with the cat in the basket, that the mother-in-law just stopped the cat by putting the basket over it. So they think every wedding needs a cat with a basket. So Prabhupada said we always have to see the underlying principle underneath things. And I think we don't do that.
No.
And when you do understand the underlying principle, you can apply it in a traditional or a non-traditional setting, and you can utilize the principle that works.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, if I'm just hearing it correctly, so healthy masculinity for boys, instead of saying this is what it looks like, it's almost like here are the kind of skills and the kind of qualities that you can develop that will help it make it easier for you to navigate. And here's some of the principles, and then. That, these are some of the tools that you're going to need to be able to learn how and when to apply them in different ways in your relationships.
Yeah.
And that brings me to the point that we also need to teach that consent always needs to be there. We just don't lord it over. And we see that that's very much understood even in, whole of society, is we take things for granted, And so we always have to ask, would you like help with that? Or how can I help you with this? Or would you like me to do this? Or is it okay if I hold your hand? Or whatever, It's like, we have to teach that the masculinity is there for the protection. So we ask what the other person wants and needs if you're really going to protect. So we have to make it broad, not just what you think.
Yes.
Is protection.
Yeah.
I remember the first time we had a date.
We weren't devotees yet.
We went for a walk, and I asked her if I could hold her hand. I didn't remember that at all. But
I distinctly remember, I'm in high school, right? And he said, is it okay if I hold your hand? And I was just like, wow. He didn't just grab my hand and, we walk along or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's nice. It's interesting, isn't it, how for a moment to think about how, whether you're a devotee or you're not a devotee, what is important and what is useful for a relationship and for a stable married type situation is very is things like dependability, respect, all of these things. And they're broadly speaking, you could say that those are the things that might attract people to each other, but there's a different dynamic that that altogether for passion and for attraction, and a lot of that is obviously perpetuated through culture and stuff that so a woman obviously, well, how can I say, but is not going to want certain behaviors from a man that she needs to depend on, that's going to look after her. But if he's going to come along on a horse and throw her over his shoulder and whatever else, that there could be some appeal to that in a different setting, like in a pure kind of. So I think it's a bit confusing for both boys and girls in terms of, it's a bit kind of, I suppose, maybe boring to just do the sensible, perfect, right thing all the time. That's maybe for when you're grown up, but when you're young and you're kind of Do you know what I'm getting at? So like it's different dynamics for different types of stages, I suppose, perhaps.
For sure. I think the guiding principle, though, is just ask if the other person's okay with it.
Yeah. But arguably, and I agree, nowadays we're fully in that zone, like we have to be, right? But in the past, the reason why it was exciting was because he threw you over his shoulder, you know, or whatever.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because he didn't, you know, so it's just,
you know,
people are navigating that whole,
right.
I mean, maybe not devotees, hopefully.
You write the letter like Rukmini wrote to Krishna. Kidnap me right here, right there.
But I'm just saying for young people though, because it's like, you know, and the reality of it is that, you know, they're not going to be just making perfect, sensible decisions all the time, like in every
Correct.
turn.
However, if you don't have that sense of respect underneath and that sense of that the other person has choice, and you're influenced by what you might click into on the media and assume that a woman might like violence, or they might like this, or they might like that, you know, you could be going, yeah.
For
so
sure.
at some point, you know.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you, how do you, like in practice in a community, what are there conversations that people have with the boys, like around things like this, like relationships and stuff, you know, in that allow for kind of the fact that maybe they are going to have some relationships?
Well, I know that in our community, we have a school in our community that's, you know, all devotee children. And usually my husband and I, we make it a point to invite them over and give them, you know, relationship smarts things. And a couple of years ago, I went in and I was just teaching them some emotional regulation tools and what happens when you're angry and what to do and things like that, and you know, how to ask questions and actually hear answers. And you know, the kids said to they were grade 10s, 11s, right? And they graduated. They said, you know, the best thing I ever learned in school, it was one of my grandsons, Grandma, was your class. It's helped me so much.
Very practical, right?
Huh?
Very practical.
Yeah.
What about also how to, I think one thing for boys, maybe in a more sheltered situation, it may not be as much, I don't know, but one of the things for boys that is really difficult to deal with is rejection. Now, I mean, I'm not going to say that I agree with this, but like there's a very famous relationship coach. I'm trying to think of her name. Very, very famous. And she says that for I'm not sure if she said for boys or for men, it's going to even be hard to say this out loud, but she says it's almost, you know, it's not necessarily the same, but it's almost kind of like rape for men. Like they feel deeply wounded, and they really struggle to deal with it. So I'd love, you know, jumping off from that, for you to say something about what about this narrative we hear that, oh, that's like, how could that be the case? Oh, just man up or deal with it, or you should be able to deal with it. Like how much do we need to make room to acknowledge that for men, certain things can be really, really difficult? Do you know what I mean?
It's very important to acknowledge that. And like we were discussing earlier, how men get triggered by that feeling of inadequacy. There was an interesting study done by one researcher, and he was researching the realm of abuse and why especially men become abusive. And the conclusion of his many years of research was that it was a failure of compassion, of self-compassion, and also being compassionate towards the other. And so men do have this need to feel like we're protecting our significant other and making them feel respected and loved and cared for. And because we have that need to be the protector, if we see our spouse or significant other unhappy with us, for men that's very painful. It's very, very painful because it makes us feel like a failure, it makes us feel inadequate. And according to how we can process that emotion, you know, it might just cause us just to lock ourselves in a cave, or maybe to become angry, or at least if we have the emotional intelligence, we might try to understand, well, what does my significant other need in this time that, that maybe she's not accepting what I'm saying right now, but maybe she has some need that I can address her need instead of just thinking of myself. That's like emotional intelligence. That's compassion.
Or what's the lesson I'm supposed to learn from this, from just some rejection of some girl you don't know well or whatever,
Yeah, that's what I mean. It seems trivial, doesn't it? And I agree. It's in one sense you can just see, come on, But the thing is often the for whatever way it is that it's processed, it can be really wounding for. So what I'm trying to get at is that.
But that's okay. You can feel it.
Yeah. Oh, it doesn't justify. I'm not saying that it justifies any reaction, but I'm just saying the feeling, though.
Yeah.
Like for example, if in that moment when you're feeling all of that feeling, and let's just say, hopefully you're just about keeping on top of it because you're kind of trying to stay rational and you're trying to use your emotional intelligence or whatever. If you're then shamed in that same moment, that's like putting gasoline and fire on it and it will explode. Mm-hmm. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's almost like you need to be superhuman to kind of like, So I'm just kind of trying to get at that thing that where we kind of like often have the narrative of like you're a man, you shouldn't be affected by that.
Yeah, it's wrong to feel like that.
Yeah.
When actually you need some empathy that, wow, that must have really hurt.
Yeah. And I guess I just wonder if I'm not sure that and that also requires that maybe big leap from the other person, whoever they are, to have that emotional regulation and intelligence to be able to do that when they're probably thinking, well, I feel like that too. So what about me? And you know what I mean? So it's kind of like.
Well, it's because we don't want the other person to feel uncomfortable. People shouldn't have uncomfortable feelings, so let's wash them away.
Squash them. Yeah. Especially for the man, maybe. I mean, I don't know how it feels as a woman to see a man like that. I know as a man that sometimes when you have any of your children or wife or whatever is feeling difficult feelings, you sometimes want to squash them because of how it makes you feel as a result.
Because we're uncomfortable around uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah. So just what do you think about that element about allowing for men to also be, I suppose, to struggle or to need to be
it's essential, and I think you have to teach that with your kids from like age 2. You got to start cultivating. It's okay to feel like that. Must have felt really bad, and wow, and then so now what can you do? But first you have to feel it and process it and see how it feels, because we know all the time when you can just kind of feel it. And you process it, it starts to dissipate. But if you try to push it away, it doesn't go away.
Yeah, for sure.
So you have to feel it for a bit, even though it's painful, and then it'll lessen. And we have to learn that, and we have to teach our kids that that's the way through it. The way out is through.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the reasons amongst the 6 loving exchanges amongst Vaishnavas that Rupa Goswami recommended. 2 of them are to reveal your mind in confidence and hear in confidence. And everyone needs that in their life, to have at least 1 or 2 people that you can actually open up to in confidence and express what you're feeling and be able to feel understood. That's such a, I remember, just teaching some men that once about that process, and one of the men said, well, he just had some 5-minute conversation with another man, and he said, well, I don't feel alone anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a massive.
You're just alone with your struggle and emotion.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think, and it doesn't even have to be like solved as such. It's just knowing that's like you're not alone.
Yeah. Sometimes just talking about it is solution.
Yeah, it's just enough. It was interesting because I was thinking, okay, what are we going to answer in this interview? So I did my Google search, and something popped up that one dad, he said, once a week I make Ask Dad Anything, and we just spend an hour together. And at first it was like silly things, like I can't remember what he said, just inconsequential things he would ask his dad. But after about a week, it was like, Dad, I've never seen you cry. How come?
Wow.
You know, like it would start to get to other things. So just the fact that, you know, the dads spend some time with the boys, that they can like ask them anything, and it's going to start out on one level. And then if we don't shame them or put them down or just hear them, that can be so much male support there. And that's like true masculinity.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was starting to think about it already from when you were saying about allowing them to have their feelings, but then you mentioned that. I'm looking forward after this conversation. I have two boys, 9 and 12, to going in and just giving them a huge hug and just sort of and trying to implement some of these little things like that. I love that idea. Just to it's I find it is hard sometimes when they're really, you know, so I see that they're very doing in the world, you know, at school and all the different things that they're doing. They're strong and they're doing all the things and they're taking part and they're launching themselves into it and everything else. And then sometimes at home, it feels like they're falling apart because they're having to keep all the, you know, held it together for the world.
Yeah.
And then that can be quite sort of uncomfortable or disorientating because you feel like, you know, you want to make sure they're okay and everything's okay. And when they're having that wobble or whatever it is, it can be really hard sometimes to not react.
Yeah. And then it's just, oh, wow, that must have been hard. Tell me more, or something like that. There's also another thing, like at the dinner table. So what was hard for you today? And what did you blow and how did you fix it? You know, like everybody gets to say like what mistake they made and how did you fix it? And you get to bring it up. Also, they say that the best thing you can do, the best gift you can give your kids is just some one-on-one time.
Yeah.
And I think that's important however they're growing up. And sometimes it's good to go somewhere with the kid and you got them in the car for half an hour going there, and that's when you can do the ask me anything because they can't jump out and you got them, you know?
Yeah.
Because they actually really do appreciate it when they feel understood and heard. It is going to help them process things, but it's going to increase your relationship phenomenally. Just the fact that you understand. Because when we feel understood, we feel loved.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that we before we started, we talked a little bit about how oftentimes, you know, the cycle, you know, from whatever hurts and traumas we had, you know, can often repeat itself. And hopefully these conversations are designed to bring some awareness and, you know, to try and break some of those patterns and cycles. But it's so often, it's easy to see, I can see it in my own upbringing and I can see it to some extent, you know, playing out with my kids, is that it's about how you feel.
Yeah.
Like I was the oldest, I was the first child, oldest, you know, son and everything. So no doubt I got tons of like praise and all the rest of it and whatever else. But actually, because they also want you to do well and whatever else, there was probably also a lot of, well, what about this? What about that? And, you know, you need to do this and you do whatever, you know. So you come away with a feeling of deficit, like it's not enough. And so it's interesting. It's like that thing, isn't it? Like, you know, someone might, like 10 people might tell you how well you're doing something. Person tells you how you're rubbish and you're not doing it or whatever. That's the thing that stays in your mind, unfortunately, you know. So it's, but the good thing is that, so what I'm saying is it can be difficult because often the things that may have the negative impact are all done with the best of intentions, but they can still have the effect. So I think that it's just, you know, pick yourself up. If you, like you said earlier, if you do lose your temper or whatever it is, you gotta just, every day's a new day. You know, it's not that you've spoiled it or ruined it, but like, you know, you gotta self-awareness and, you know, like these
the repair is what's important. How well you repair. It's not whether you make a mistake. It's how quickly and how well you repair.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we've covered quite a few good things. Hopefully it's useful for people who are watching. I guess this will be posted and perhaps there'll be a way once we know where it's posted for you to leave comments and, you know, maybe even questions. And once we know where it is, we may be able to have a look and answer those questions on the chat at that time. One thing I'd love to kind of finish up with, unless there's anything else you'd like to talk about, is how do we teach boys lessons from the scripture that help to foster that sense of respect and honoring and kind of, even protecting women. Because sometimes perhaps we may hear other ones. So a couple of examples where that's kind of really explicit would be great.
One thing we did in our community, not just with boys, but with girls also, we take the kids from the school, maybe from like 14 to grade 12, and we do a Bhagavad Gita study session. And we'd have them come to our house, a very relaxed setting, and we'd have them read a verse and just ask them, well, what does that mean to you? And have them explain it. It was very informal, and we didn't teach or preach down to them, but we just asked them, well, what did you get out of that?
And then they would start asking questions, and then what they need to learn.
And they would ask amazing questions, and then we would say, well, you guys have such great questions. How come you don't ask questions at the temple?
Yeah.
And they would say things like, well, we're afraid if we ask a question at the temple, they're going to think we're stupid, just asking some stupid question. But just coming down to their level and just treating them like human beings, and we made it like fun and entertaining. And I remember at one point we probably went through 3 different groups of young teenagers over the years, and at one point I was thinking, well, maybe this is a little too frivolous, because it was actually a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And there was one boy in the first group who went to England for a few years, and then he came back a few years later, and he came up to me and he said, I want to thank you for that Bhagavad Gita thing we did, when we were kids. He said, actually saved my life. So I said, okay, we did something right there.
Yeah, for sure.
I think they would read things, in Prabhupada's purports, and they said, well, didn't this come out in the early 70s? Why did you guys do all these dumb things? Prabhupada's not saying that here.
Yeah, that's amazing. Exactly, because it's so interesting to see how someone can see it fresh, because sometimes I find, at least, once you've sort of seen things in a certain way, it's hard to unsee it in that way.
Yeah, whereas, but the kids do. Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And I think what I love about that thing you created there is that it highlights that oftentimes in the normal way we do it, there's this sort of idea that there's a correct way to see it. And there's one correct way to see it.
It's called indoctrination? No, sorry.
No, really. But it is. It is. And I think it's so it's very damaging, because I think when, like the way you explained it, when the person, whoever they are, can work it through for themselves in their own way, with guidance or whatever, a group, and kind of then get a certain understanding of it, that's real. Like, that's actually a real thing they have.
And it's less limiting. Like, I would find they would come up with these really interesting realizations that I never thought of, because they didn't have the programmed ones. Yeah. And they were sometimes very phenomenal realizations that I hadn't even heard from adults.
Exactly. And I think I agree, and I'm actually quite inspired by that, because I feel at the moment I feel a bit stuck with, like, I know in my head, you could tell me anything, any question about anything, and I would feel like I know the answer for that, because I've got the script, right? I know what the answer that would normally be given for that. And it really does feel, it's less, I don't know, there's something about it that just doesn't feel right. Yeah. And yeah, so that's actually, I love that. Yeah, it's great. So yeah, but would you like to share, maybe you mentioned a couple earlier, like some examples, maybe where it's very clear, that actually women were very valued in the society?
I came across a very interesting article. Actually, it was sent to us by devotee Madhavananda, who I know him. I know he still lives in Jagannath Puri. Yeah. And it was a article from the Harmonist magazine around 1936 that's attributed to Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, describing a Vaishnava marriage. And it's very, very interesting. It begins by saying that both the man and the woman, when they're looking to marry, they both should only accept someone as a spouse who they see as a better servant of the Lord than themselves. So, how do you do that? It's like impossible. But the paradox is solved if you realize, well, we both have to become mutually humble and respectful. And then it describes that neither the husband or the wife has any right or sense of proprietorship over the service or the property of the other. Neither can demand service from the other, or neither can impose their service upon the other. And then it explains how this system of marriage, like Vaishnav marriage, has its origin in the worship of the household deity. So what I took from that is like, okay, maybe you got a picture of Gauratai, maybe you have Gauratai brass deities, wood deities, Radha Krishna. They're the boss of the house, and we're meant to cooperate and serve together, to serve the household deity, and live peacefully together. That's going to make Krishna happy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to teach our kids too, that the home is actually a place to practice Krishna consciousness. It's not something different. It's the practicum for this philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And the more we can, do that in our families, and our kids grow up seeing that, okay, my parents are actually practically applying Krishna consciousness, they're peaceful and happy, they have problems, they work them out, but they're still working together and they're happy. And that's going to go a long way to solving a lot of these things like domestic abuse when kids grow up in healthy atmospheres.
So you see, like in the Mahabharata, when Draupadi was dishonored there, that was, maybe their hands were tied at that very moment, but there was no letting that slide. It's like the whole Battle of Kurukshetra is practically stemmed from the honor of Draupadi there. Mm-hmm. And we see the great lengths that Lord Ramachandra went to protect Sita. Mm-hmm. So sometimes scriptures explain that because women are so valuable, they're like jewels, and maybe they're kept a little protected because they're so valuable. And when you see it in that light, it's not that they're low and useless. It's because they're so valuable. And that's the real essence of Scripture, and we have to see it in that way, and we have to manifest it in our everyday dealings. Because, Prabhupada said that, we should even dress or act like ladies and gentlemen. So the word gentle, man, means that, also that gentleness has to be there for people that you're looking after.
Yeah.
And that's what makes you a real man.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. It's kind of like maybe in one paradigm it's seen as a weaker man, but actually in a way it's so, I mean, I'm not sure if people will, it's a different context, but there's quite someone that's quite popular nowadays called Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you've heard of him. He has this thing, he says a man should be like, fierce and be able to be like that and then control it. So it's not that he shouldn't be able to have that aspect to himself, but actually you're much more of a man if you could be like that, but actually you're controlling it.
Yeah, for sure.
So he talked about the idea better to be a soldier in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not saying obviously we're all different, as men, but
yeah.
But I feel like you can't really have a virtue if you don't have the thing to be controlling in the first place. Do you know what I mean? So I think no, it's a really, really nice point. I was just going to something on that. Yes, one of the things. So we were asked a similar question at the time by an article they were doing when we were making the film about my wife and I. What would we teach our kids and our boys? One of the things was that girls also are going to make mistakes. They're not perfect. they are, just like you. They're going to be going through different. They're not an alien. They're not aliens. They're just like you. They're maybe a different gender. Because I think sometimes what we can do in society, and also we heard a lot when we were in India asking people, is we can either put women up on a platform, so they're like Sita or these kind of like goddesses or whatever, or on the other extreme, unfortunately, there's other terms for what we think of women, but actually to have respect for the normal woman in the middle, who isn't a goddess and who isn't whatever, and but is just a real human being with all the frailties and challenges of everybody else. Like, I think that's where the real challenge is to have respect in that middle sphere, for normal people who are women. Is a help.
Normal is good.
Yeah.
Normal's supposed to be normal.
But you know what I mean? Because sometimes we can go like, well, a woman's respectable if she's like this. Mm-hmm. If she's not like that, then she's nothing.
No, but that's how that's the definition I was giving about how women are programmed to have that false self-esteem. If we do it to please everybody else, then we're good.
Yeah.
But the fact is, each and every person is part and parcel of Krishna and deserving of love and respect and value. Period.
Yeah.
Maybe they do something wrong that there's some consequence, but you're just dealing with the action. It's not the person. And we have to see that Vaishnava vision.
Yeah, for sure. So is there anything else thank you, first of all. Thank you so much. It's been a really, I found there's a lot of things to go away and think about. So thank you so much. Anything else that you feel you'd like to share that, or touch on that you maybe haven't already? Or
I would just encourage the audience to really explore the subject of emotional intelligence in relationship to Krishna consciousness, and also what it means to be compassionate and how to apply compassion, in all circumstances. Like we were talking about anger, and generally we become angry if someone is going to attack us or attack our family. That's the proper use of anger. But because of the material conditionings and these kind of traumas, we become angry at the people we love the most.
They're the ones, unfortunately.
Wrong there. We're failing at compassion and misusing anger. So we really need to align our responses to those emotions with our real values, which are, love and compassion. And it's something we have to explore as Vaishnavas and work towards really understanding what's really going on in my heart, and how can I manifest that kind of love and compassion in a proper way. And that's where our Krishna consciousness will flourish in our relationships around us.
Because we always say that the relationships, it's your practicum. It's showing exactly how advanced you are. You can spout all these slokas you want, but how are you behaving in everyday interactions? Yeah. That's the test of your Krishna consciousness.
I agree, and I think it's such an important point because, primarily, I would think for ourselves, for our own benefit, but also, if we touch on the idea that, we say, how does it look if people from, general society look to us? Like, how can we have a leg to even stand on to say anything to them if we can't, like, even do the basic things in a healthy way?
Yeah.
Embarrassing.
Yeah.
Very, So I think that...
However, the whole world struggles with this.
Yes, true.
And we should be able to apply the philosophy in our lives to overcome this. And that's the advantage we have, and we should utilize it.
Exactly. So I suppose in a way, of course, the philosophy is there, and the ultimate goal is to develop, this pure love and all of that, which is, wonderful goal. But I suppose in practice, like you say, if someone's looking in and we're thinking of saying something to them, it should have some practical application and benefit to us also, because otherwise it's almost like saying, well, there's here and we're trying to get here, things in between might be pretty crap, but just hold on. It's like, no, okay, it's a great goal, but it should also be, there should be some practical application, like a benefit, to the quality of your life.
Yes, exactly. I was reading recently. It was a morning walk conversation, and Prabhupada made some statement to the effect that, someone said, Prabhupada, well, sometimes devotees aren't happy. And Prabhupada, he said, well, if they're not happy, they're not devotee, or you're not up to standard. So we're supposed to become happy. And if we're not happy, we need to do some little internal digging and find out, well, what am I doing that's kind of blocking me from feeling that happiness of devotional service? That's important. Otherwise, we can become conditioned to that state of dissatisfaction and think that is Krishna consciousness.
And think it's the struggle. The struggle. It's like the martyrdom kind of thing. Yeah. So what I'm hearing just there, and in a couple of things we've said, which may be a theme, is learning to utilize the philosophy, the tools, the texts, all of it, in almost to come away from the script and to engage with it in a personal way.
Yes.
In community, so that and ultimately that it should have some utility if applied correctly beyond just it's supposed to be good just because they say it's good. Like it should have some, right?
Really, Krishna consciousness is having loving relationships between the devotees and Krishna. That's the application. You learn all this scripture in so that you can do that. You have to have those. It's relational. Krishna consciousness is relational. And if we can't treat others well, how is Krishna happy?
Great. Thank you. Anything else that you'd like to say?
I'd just like to say thank you also. It was your conversation also was very enlightening for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for sharing your insights.
Yes. It's broadened our perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll say goodbye to the audience. We'll say Hare Krishna to everybody. Hope there's lots to think about there, and I would invite the audience if they have time to, and not just sort of tune in and just listen, but maybe think about some things they can actually take away and practically, even if it's just one thing.
Yes.
It starts with one thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that too. After this, I'm going to just make some notes, and there's definitely a few things there that I can really apply. So thank you. We'll sign off. Hare Krishna.
Okay. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama.